I went upstairs and I told my wife that I was ready to have every single uncomfortable conversation out there, right? It was like I went to the uncomfortable conversation dragon and I pulled out my sword and I slayed it because I just slayed this uncomfortable conversation dragon. I was ready to go have all of them. Welcome to the Ryan Rice Show, where we talk about what we learned yesterday that we can apply today so that we can be better tomorrow. I hope you enjoy and subscribe. I recently had to let go of an employee, and this was actually one of my original employees. We were on good terms. This wasn't performance related, but I have made recently some strategic business decisions, and the decisions that I've made his job go away. And I want to share with you what I learned and how I did it. This was an incredibly difficult conversation with me, and there were some struggles that I had throughout, and I want to share what those were, how I overcame them, and what the outcome of the situation was. Who am I? My name is Ryan Rice. I'm a real estate investor. Before real estate investing, I spent over a decade leading large teams. For example, the team that I was leading prior to leaving that career was across 3 or 4 different states. I had 8 direct reports, and the teams that we supported did over $4 billion in sales. So I have a little bit of experience in leadership and people management, etc. And I don't share any of that to try to impress you. I share it so that you know that this information is coming from the context of everything that I just talked about. And I think that's important for you to know so you can make a decision on whether or not you should listen to anything that I have to say. So I'm going to share with you step by step what this conversation was, how I prepared for the conversation, how the conversation went, and what the outcome of it was. And I'll recap in the end with some things that I learned and some takeaways that I had so that you can crush all of the difficult conversations that are in front of you and that you might be avoiding. And I'll share with you how it was that I pushed through and what the light bulb moment was for me when I realized that I was avoiding this conversation. So maybe you can apply some of the same thought processes so that you don't have to avoid any of these difficult conversations. So getting into it, this, like I mentioned, was an incredibly difficult conversation for me. I dreaded having it. When I made some of these strategic business decisions, I knew that I was going to have it. And the second that I made that realization, it was like my heart dropped. But I knew that long term for the business, it was going to be the best decision for my business and hence for my family. So once I made the decision that involved the strategic maneuvering that was going to lead to this position being eliminated, I had some lingering issues that logically made sense for me to keep this position until some of those lingering issues were gone, right? And I was emotionally justifying those lingering issues for keeping him on. I was emotionally justifying keeping him on due to the fact that I had some of these lingering issues. And it was almost like an excuse that I gave myself to just continue keeping on board for a little bit longer, hence avoiding having to have the discussion. Well, I realized after a couple weeks of doing this that the reason that I was keeping him on was purely because I was avoiding the conversation. I hadn't come up with a plan to deal with these lingering issues. And as I sat there and I thought through what if I were to come up with a plan, the solutions were rather apparent and it wasn't overly complicated. And as I went through that exercise in my mind, I simply realized that I had avoided coming up with this plan because it put off this difficult conversation. So as soon as I made this realization, I sat down and I listed all of the issues that were currently present that were leading to me avoiding having this conversation, because having him in this role helped make sure that I wouldn't have to deal with or do anything about some of these lingering issues in the business. So I wrote them all out, and then I made a plan to take care of each one, and it had a lot of hypotheticals and, hey, if this happens, we'll do this, we'll do this. And then I started putting that plan into action, and I essentially, for every lingering issue that I had in the business, I came up with a solution. And just that exercise alone helped me realize, like, oh, it's not actually that bad. If I actually follow through and do some of these things, then without him in that position, that won't be as painful. And, a quick caveat on that, or a quick side note on that, something that we have to realize as business owners. So, for all you entrepreneurs out there, there's going to be times where we have to make decisions to let people go. Sometimes it might be performance related, sometimes it might be more strategy related. And that is going to make our life as the owner a little bit more painful. And I do believe that it's super, super important that we don't avoid that pain. That's kind of what we signed up for as entrepreneurs. And so we simply have to take it on, realize that, hey, it is going to be a little bit painful, but there can be also a lot of benefits in doing that because we can be really involved in that department for a little bit. We can get a very good pulse, and there are some long-term strategic benefits to being that involved and then creating a plan for the path forward. So I just wanted to share that. But to give you guys some context around the relationship that I had with this individual, it was a pretty solid relationship. This person I brought on almost 2 years ago and was very, very helpful for the business. I brought on to this person when it was utter chaos. I had over 20 flips going on. All of them were full gut flips, all new mechanicals. We were doing additions left and right. I mean, it was absolutely bananas when I brought this person on in the business. And he had helped through a lot of trials and tribulations in the business. And we were transitioning out of the crazy phase and into a significantly more stable phase. And the role that he played was super, super helpful. And so the idea and the thought of letting him go was a tough one for me. And every time I thought about that, having that conversation, like sometimes I would even get emotional because of how helpful that this individual had been. And again, we had built a really good relationship. And as I thought through the plan of exit, I knew that it was very, very important that I made the entire situation about him. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about me and how bad that I felt or how uncomfortable that it made me. I knew that if I was going to have this conversation and have it effectively, like none of that actually mattered. I needed to put myself in his shoes and consistently think about how he might feel and make this all about him. And so I had to get over these feelings that I had about my discomfort and about how tough it was on me, because none of that at the end of the day mattered. He was the one that was being impacted. And I felt that it was important that I think about that from that frame. And so I started to make bullets to outline the conversation that I was going to have. So I started kind of a preparation phase. And I asked myself over and over and over, what will he be thinking through this? What kind of things will he want to know? What will cause him anxiety? How can I deliver this message in a way that minimizes pain, that minimizes anxiety? And I came up with this rough outline of the things that I would cover in this conversation. And I came up with that outline based on the frame of imagine putting myself in his shoes and what would be the appropriate way to communicate, and how can I communicate in a way that is going to deliver information to him quickly so that it reduces anxiety while at the same time coming off empathetic. And I came up with a nice little outline. And then what I did is I literally practiced having the conversation. So I sat in front of my laptop with a webcam and I hit the record button and I went through and I practiced the entire thing. And I'm very glad that I did this because I would hit record, I would finish, and then I would watch the video. I would make corrections in my notes, or I would make corrections. Some of the corrections, for example, were like with myself physically. And then I would repeat And I did this over and over and over and over. I probably recorded, I don't know, 10 plus videos of having this conversation. And for context, this conversation, it took me anywhere from 4 to 6 minutes, I think, to deliver all of the information that I needed to deliver. And so I put in a good amount of practice, and I recorded this conversation many, many times for the context of it just being a 5-minute conversation. But what I noticed is that every time the recording got better, and every time I would watch it, and I would think, ooh, maybe that's not the right time to say that. And let me think about how he might interpret that, or let me put myself in his shoes. How can I word that in a little bit better of a way, or how can I deliver this in a more timely way that's going to relieve some anxiety for him? And that turned out to be super, super effective. But I practiced it so many times, and I put it on video so many times until I watched the video, and I was like, okay, I don't know what else I can do to make it better. I think that this feels really good. And what was interesting, just to give you guys context of the backdrop of the difficulty that I had having this conversation, every single video that I recorded, when I got to the part about the fact that we were separating, I got emotional, right? Those of you that know me personally, I'm not like a super emotional, at least that's the category that I'll put myself in. I don't get overly emotional on a lot of things, but I wanted to give you guys that context because, again, this was difficult for me. Real quick, as you guys know, I just recently started this podcast. If you could give it a rating with a quick tap of the thumb, that would mean the world to me. And even more importantly, it could help spread the word to a broader audience, which in turn could help change a life. Thank you so much, and let's get back to the show. So, as we got closer to the time of when I had this conversation scheduled, I practiced it a few more times, but at the end of the day, I was ready to rock and roll. I was ready to have the conversation. And so we had the conversation. My heart felt like it was beating about 190 beats per minute. It probably was. But what was really interesting is that the second I started talking, it was like, boom, I had prepared enough so that I could deliver the message effectively. And the conversation went extremely well. It was probably the best possible outcome of a conversation that I could have asked for. And I'm very grateful for that. And I think a lot of that had to do with the preparation that I put in. And so we went through my, 4 to 6 minute monologue that of the information that I was giving him. And then honestly, we chatted for quite a bit of time about random things. And, I think some of the things that I did to prepare for his departure that really, really helped. And I think this is important because I wasn't just practicing what I was going to say. From the outset, I thought about putting myself in his shoes and what can I do to make his situation better? How can I reduce his anxiety? He's a caregiver for his family. How can I help with that transition? So I knew at least 2 to 3 people that were looking for someone like him and that were trying to hire somebody for a position that he would be a good fit for. And I reached out to those people ahead of time and I had conversations with them individually, let them know that I was making some strategic business changes and that him and I would be separating. And I advocated for him in that position. And that turned out to be really, really helpful. He is actually working for one of them now. So he took about a week off and then went immediately into another role. And it was a role that I had talked with that business owner about. We had done some work with together previously. And so they had a relationship already. And it was a smooth transition. And I think that having that preparation, not only for the conversation itself, but how else could I help him? And then I went and I actively looked in this community of where I could help place him. And I did that work ahead of time. Turned out to be very fruitful because now he's working for one of them. And then I think The second thing that I did that helped that conversation and move that conversation along well is I paid him a severance, right? And, for some context around severances, he had been with me not even 2 years. And so do I think that I overpaid him what I had to in giving him a severance? Probably, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. And I wanted to set him and his family up. And at the end of the day, it was a handful of a few $1,000. And I think it was something that just helped him in his transition. And I made sure that I communicated the severance very quickly in the conversation, right? Because when I first started practicing, like the very first time that I recorded this conversation and then I watched it, it took me a little bit of time to get to this part. But the more, like when I watched the first and the second recording, the more time in between when I started talking and the time that I told him I was going to give him a severance, it was like every time I put myself in his shoes, this pent up anxiety was flowing through me because all I can think about is like, when is my next paycheck? Right. So that was one thing that watching the recording was very helpful with, because I got to put myself in his shoes and reduce the amount of time from the time that I started talking to the time that I introduced the idea of this severance, because I wanted to essentially communicate it quickly so that he could be at ease, so that then we could progress through the rest of the conversation and he could actually engage and listen in the conversation versus have his head spinning about, what is he going to do next, and have this feeling of anxiety. So at least that was my experience. Communicating the severance quickly seemed to reduce short-term anxiety, and then we actually were able to have a productive conversation. So that was the conversation that I had, and that was kind of the preparation that I had going through it. And so I want to transition into what it was that I learned. And there were 4 big takeaways that I had from this situation. First is progress is on the other side of difficult conversations. And it can feel very comfortable to avoid those comfortable conversations. But what's kind of funny and ironic, after I had this conversation, when it was done, I went upstairs and I told my wife that I was ready to have every single uncomfortable conversation out there, right? It was like I went to the uncomfortable conversation dragon and I pulled out my sword and I slayed it. And because of that, it was because I just slayed this uncomfortable conversation dragon, I was ready to go have all of them, right? So it reinforced this feeling inside that said that I could do hard things. And that was good. And I think what was helpful for me for that is now I have this feeling kind of in my holster per se, that next time there might be this difficult conversation that presents itself, regardless of what it's surrounding, I can kind of pull out that dragon that I slayed this uncomfortable, or I can pull out the sword that I slayed this uncomfortable conversation dragon with, and I'm just ready and equipped to go have the next one. So I think that's important, because I think as entrepreneurs, it's just too easy to avoid having these conversations. And honestly, the quicker that we can have them, the faster we're actually going to be able to progress in our business. And the more that we have them, the better we get at them. The second takeaway that I had, or the second learning that I had, is when we feel those little lingering things that prevent us from having the uncomfortable conversation or taking the next action. It was so simple, the exercise that I did, and I felt almost stupid afterwards, because I literally spent 10 minutes coming up with a plan for all the lingering issues that was preventing me from actually executing on this decision. And it was like within 10 to 15 minutes, I had the solutions. And then I had a couple 5-minute conversations after that put those solutions into place. So with maybe 20 to 25 minutes of work, I got rid of all of the reasons of why I shouldn't move forward, have this discussion, so that this position would be eliminated, and so that I could just move on to the next stage of strategic growth with my business. And I think that was a good lesson for me because it was just easy to continue to have him in place. He was taking care of these things. It wasn't something I needed to worry about. But again, the more time that went by, I just realized I simply hadn't sat down and just made a solution for those things. So when I did, that was very helpful. My third takeaway is a little bit of a nuance of, and I'll call it my version of a quote from Benjamin Franklin, which his quote is, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." I'm going to kind of twist that into, "An ounce of prep is worth a pound of act." And I truly believe that the outcome of that conversation was due to the preparation that I put into it. It was a 5-minute conversation, and I prepared maybe, 10x that. And I think that made all the difference. And I think I can translate that learning into anything, right? And I actually listened to a recent Alex Hormozi podcast where he did a whole podcast about preparation and even talked about that Benjamin Franklin quote. And I think Hormozi's version of it might have been even a little bit different. But taking that learning of preparation for that quick conversation and taking that into small things like meetings that I have every week, or meetings that I might have monthly or quarterly, or maybe it's something that I'm doing one time. And what if I'm doing it one time, what should my preparation for that look like in that one time versus something that I'm doing regularly? But it's amazing. Let's say I'm having a weekly one-on-one with someone on my sales team. It's amazing how much more effective that one-on-one will be if I literally take 10 to 15 minutes before and I look at this employee that I'm having the one-on-one with, and I look at his developmental path, where we've come, where we are now, what do we need to focus on to get him to the next level. It's like literally 10 to 15 minutes of preparation makes that conversation so much more effective. And I think this was a very good example of that. The last takeaway that I had, and learning number 4, is that I need to make decisions more quickly. And had I made this decision weeks prior, I could have saved some cash in my business, which any cash in any business is important. And I could have just been on to the next stage of strategy for my business, and I could have put him in his next opportunity much sooner. And the quicker I can make difficult decisions, and it's not that I need to make them hastily. I had plenty of time to make the decision, but the more quickly I can act, especially once the decision has been made, then the more effective of a leader I'm going to be, the closer to the destination I'm going to be able to move my business in a quicker manner. And I think that's important for us as entrepreneurs is, number one, that we make not hasty, but quick, decisive decisions. And once the decision has been made, the actions that are required as a result of that decision should be taken almost immediately. And I think had I done that, that would have been a better situation for everyone involved. And that's a good learning that I'll take into my next phase. So that's it. That was a difficult conversation I had. Those were the learnings that I had from it. I hope you guys got some value out of it. If there is someone that you feel that would benefit from hearing this podcast episode, I would be super, super incredibly grateful if you share this with them. That is the only way that this podcast grows, and that's how you can give me good feedback that you like what I'm doing, is that you send it to somebody else. But I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for your most precious asset, which is your attention. I appreciate you. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.